Hey guys, today I'm talking about making a very unusual soda, and it's usually very simple to make, but there's some very specific rules you have to follow. Now this is non-alcoholic, and it's a soda. It'd be a great project to do with kids, but there is some possibility of toxic issues if you use the wrong ingredients. I'm going to put those on the screen as we go. But this is a pine needle soda. It's super easy to make. It only requires 3 ingredients, but it requires very specific ways to make it succeed. Many people try this and it fails, but I can tell you exactly why it fails, and I'll show you how to do that. But let's get out into the yard and we'll hunt down some pine needles if I can find them. And there's one specific problem with pine trees in my yard, and I'll show you in just a sec. Now behind this stand of cattails is one of the pine trees I have in my yard, and if you look at it closely, you'll notice it's anywhere from 80, maybe 90 feet tall. They can grow up to 100 feet and beyond. It's a loblolly pine. And we have many, I live in the southeast, we have many different types of pines here. There are some pines out west that's recommended not to use, and I don't believe they grow normally here unless someone has brought it in from a nursery and planted it. But one thing we have to do is we have to find a pine tree where we can actually collect the needles. Unless I have some climbing equipment, I won't be able to get the needles off that tree. But under the pine trees, in the area where there's no grasses, I can find lots of small pine trees that are starting out. So just remember, one important thing to remember is that pine trees, if you're going to a forest where they're professionally growing these, they're going to be often treated with herbicides and pesticides because they're growing it for lumber. So just make sure that you know that the pine trees that you're collecting are safely growing in a forest that hasn't been treated with any of those potentially toxic substances, herbicides, pesticides, growth regulators, whatever else they put on them. So just remember, you're wanting to get pine needles that have no chemicals in them. So let me see if I can find some small pine trees where we can collect the needles in our collection device here. As you can see, this pine tree is completely dead. It's been dead in my yard for about 5 years, and I believe it was attacked by pine beetles. But a lot of pine trees are treated specifically with pesticides to stop pine beetles from killing them. If you go to a national forest, you can see huge areas, especially out west, huge areas of conifers, pines, and other trees that have been attacked by these type of beetles. So let's keep looking for some pine needles and we'll head back into the greenhouse. So before I move all this equipment out of my way, this was my beer making kit, and occasionally I do make my own homemade beer. So if you're interested in making beer rather than soda, which is not this soda particularly, is non-alcoholic, I'll put a link in the description for a beer making kit. But I really enjoy doing this. It's just one of my many hobbies that I have, and it's just interesting to go through the process and you learn from your mistakes. So it's not always as easy as you would think it would be, but using the right equipment, you can make some really high quality beer. So let's move on to talking about our pine needle soda. Now these are really some great young quality pine needles. They're very green. I don't know if it shows up as well on the camera maybe, but anyways, these have never been treated with any kind of pesticide or herbicide. So that's one thing that's important to remember. Also, if you're pregnant or nursing, you don't want to consume anything with pine needles. There could be some issues there. And I'll put on the screen right here, I'm going to put species of pine needle, put a full screen here with a list of pine needles here that are safe to use, or pine species. And then the second screen, I'm going to put some that may have issues and some that you should never use, because there's some species such as the yew, that you can see in the second page listing, that they are not safe, and it's not actually a true pine. So just take a close look at that, freeze the screen, and make sure you identify what type of pine needles you have in your yard. So let's talk just a sec for some of the tools you're going to need to make the pine needle soda. You're going to need a container to make it in that can stand a pressure buildup. So you don't want to do anything made of very thin glass or something that you wouldn't normally use for pressurized things like canning and things like that. I've got some mason jars, and then I've got these specialty jars that have flip lids on them. I'll show you right there. It can allow a little bit of pressure buildup, and if it becomes too high, a little bit of pressure can escape from around the rubber seal. So that's one of the great things about these type of bottles, is you don't have to worry about a bottle cracking or even exploding under pressure. Now, I don't think the pine needle soda is going to get that high of a pressure, but there is always a possibility if you used a lot of sugar, if you added any yeast to the product, and there is a natural yeast growing on the leaves. So one thing I would recommend is, if you're going to wash these, wash them very gently in cold water. Don't do a strong hot water rinse on these, because you're going to remove the yeast. It's what makes the pine needle soda work. So whether you're using mason jars or these specialty bottles, make sure you do something like that, because like I said, if you're using just a regular old jar that you had in the kitchen, it may not be able to take the pressure that builds up inside of it. So I'll put links to both of these in the description. I personally like these better because they're easy to use and they've got the flip lid, and I've used these for many years for my beer, so they work great, and I know they can withstand interior pressure building up. Now the pine needle soda just has 3 really simple ingredients. You need some type of sugar, you need water, and it can't be tap water because tap water can have chlorines and chemicals in it that could actually kill the yeast that's going to be growing in this. So just make sure that you're using something like a pure water, spring water, highly filtered water, and if it fails, you know that might be one of the reasons that it failed, is that you use some type of water with a chlorine content in it. Now the sugar can be lots of different types of sugar. If you want to go all natural, you could use a honey, an organic honey, or an organic maple syrup. You can use cane sugar, organic cane sugar, or if the only thing you have around the house is white granulated sugar. So any one of these would work. I'd say for a bottle this size, roughly about 2 tablespoons, possibly up to 4 tablespoons, depending on how much carbonation you like in your drink. So minimum of 2 and maximum of 4 for a bottle this size. In the mason jar, you're probably going to have 3 to 4 anyways, because you have a little bit more content in there. So just remember, that's the 3 ingredients: pine needles, your sugar, and your water, and it needs to be purified water, as I said just a second ago. Now, when you're making this, and this is true of beer, wine, or this pine needle soda, you want to make sure you sanitize everything you're using with soap and water and do a really good rinse with some type of water that doesn't have chlorine, like as I said, because that can kill it. So make sure your glassware, you're going to need a nice mesh strainer like this. You can use cheesecloth, or you can use a mesh strainer. I'm going to prefer this because it's going to be a little bit easier and cleanup wise. You're going to need a funnel, and you're going to need some measuring spoons. And as I said, make sure you sanitize everything before use. Just a little bit of impurity on any one of these might cause your pine needle soda to fail. Now in my kitchen, I have a special cabinet just for the beer making, and it rarely gets open, and I can put it in there, and it's in a cool, dark place. But it's not too cool, because if you keep your house at a nice 71, 72 degrees, that can be another reason it fails. So having some very gentle heat from beneath can really help. These seed starting mats that you plug in can provide just enough heat to allow the fermentation process to take place, and the bacteria, the yeast I should say, is going to grow properly and create the carbonation effect. So just remember that if it's too cold, you might have a complete failure in it. Another thing is, if you set this in the windowsill, it's going to absolutely get too hot. So you want it to be in a cool, dry, dark place. And if it's too cool, like I said, if it's below, let's say 75 to 78 degrees, it might fail for that reason. So having some nice gentle heat from below. I'll put a link to these seed starting mats because I've got them all over the greenhouse. But in the wintertime, you will need to use that. The summer, maybe not so much, because you'll have a cabinet, they're stored away. But if you're going to have it out in the open and you have AC running, again, you want to have some gentle heat from below, but especially in the wintertime. Now it's midsummer here right now, but I will say that the best time to do this, and it will work year round, you can do it anytime, but the best time where you're going to get the best results is springtime and early summer, because of the yeast that's going to be on the leaves themselves. So that's one thing to remember, is that if you do this and it failed and you did it in the dead of wintertime, that might be the issue, is the timing of the year. But you can still try it. I think it'll still work. I've never made any in the coldest month of the year, but I have made it in early spring where it's still pretty cold outside. Now before I show you the exact process, I want to talk just a minute about a few optional items you can do. You can use champagne yeast, baker's yeast, and you can add just a very small amount, maybe 1/4 of a tablespoon to something this size, maybe half of a teaspoon. I said a tablespoon, I meant to say a teaspoon. 1/4 of a teaspoon for something this, and half of a teaspoon of the yeast and something like that. I don't think you're going to need it, but if you really want high carbonation, that will really help. Another thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that if you want to have added flavor, because this is going to be a little bit on the plain side, it's going to taste, you'll definitely get a little bit of a pine citrusy flavor, but if you want to add a lot more flavor, you can use ginger or lemon or whatever your favorite type of citrus is, and that will really boost the taste. A lot of people say this tastes like Sprite. It sort of does, but it's kind of a weak tasting Sprite, a little bit more on the side of carbonated water and just a little bit of flavor. So that's one of the things. If you don't like just plain carbonated water with very light flavoring, you may want to add something like the ginger, the lemon, or whatever your favorite citrus is. So let me show you step by step how to do this. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our pine needles, and I've already done this outside. I gave them a very light rinse with just regular water from my rain barrel. I didn't put any of the tap water on them, so they've been watered, and I allowed them to dry just a little bit. not in the sunlight, but in the darkness of the greenhouse, allow them to dry out. So you want to keep them out of the sun once you do this process. Now next, I'm going to take the pine needles and I'm going to cut them into about 2 to 3 inch strips, each one. And probably my scissors are not quite as sharp as they need to be, but we're just going to take each set of pine needles and cut them in. Another way that you can identify these is that pine needles grow in groups. If you see there's 3 needles here. Now, sometimes this can be a little bit difficult because it can also depend on what area of the country you live in, but there's 3 needles growing in each bunch. This particular type, based on where I live here in the southeastern United States, this is most certainly a loblolly pine. So very common here, and they grow very large. You can do a little bit of research on pines. Again, remember, there's some pines you don't want to use and others you do. So let's cut this up and get all of our pine needles ready to go into our containers. Now, one thing I didn't mention is that pine needles have resins and sticky things in them like that. So if you don't like the sticky nature of it, you can wear a pair of very thin, like rubber gloves, and you can do this process. It doesn't bother me because I can just take a little bit of rubbing alcohol and get those sticky resins off my hands. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add these to our 2 containers, and then we're going to wait. I would recommend waiting 6 to 7 days. A lot of people say 2 to 3 days, but I don't think your carbonation level is going to be high enough. So I would say a solid 6 days. Check it and wait 1 additional day if not. And there's ways to do this to be extra safe. If you think that you have a lot of carbonation, maybe you added a lot of sugar, maybe more than the recommended amount, you can degas them just a little bit by just opening it and allow a little bit of gas to escape, and then re-tighten the lid. Make sure it's good and tight so it continues to do the process. But if you're afraid of any type of too much gassing and you're afraid of a cracking in your bottle or jar, you can do that little degassing thing in about 3 days. But again, I would give it a solid 6 days before you go to the final product. All right, so we're gonna fill our bottle and our mason jar both with as much pine we don't have to have it heavily packed, but we just wanna make sure it's filled up to the top. So I'd say about maybe 2 cups in the mason jar before you start, because once you cut them up, it's gonna be a much smaller amount, especially now that you're removing the stems from the needles. And also in this, it's probably gonna be at least 1 cup in your flip top jar. So just remember, the amount that you collect is going to be a lot less once you get through the processing of the needles. So one thing I will tell you is that I like to add the sugars in after I have my pine needles in the container. Whether you're using granulated sugar or cane sugar, you may want to dissolve them in some water, just a little bit of heat on them. Make sure, of course, you're not using tap water. Don't bring it to a boil, just slightly heat it on a stove and just stir it slowly where it completely dissolves. That will add to your success rate. So if you have a problem, it didn't work the first time, try dissolving your sugar. So we're gonna take 2 tablespoons of white sugar. Make sure I got the container properly open there. And we're gonna put 2 tablespoons in our jar, in our flip top bottle, and in our jar, I'm going to do 3. I think there's a little bit more liquid contained in this one, so I'm going to do 3 tablespoons on our jar. And it's probably the same equivalent in honey, the same measurement in honey or maple syrup. Just do a little bit of experimentation, because some people like less carbonation, some people like more. Some people want a sweeter taste, some people want a less sweet taste. So just remember, it all depends on your personal preference. And these little funnels, these kitchen funnels, make it super easy to get it inside of your flip top bottle. Now next, I'm going to add in my captured rainwater that I've purified. And I'm going to fill the bottle not to the top. We need to allow a little bit of air at the top for the gas buildup. So leave about 2 inches in your bottle if you're using this type of flip bottle for the gas expansion in there. Next, the same rule applies. I'll probably have to use my water container here there. The same rule applies here. You want to leave about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in the top of your mason jar, just in case there's a lot of gas expansion. So don't fill it all the way to the top. We're going to put our lid on very tightly. And we're going to check this, like I said, in about 6 days and take a look at it. But I'm not going to open it until the 7th day. So I'm going to give it 1 solid week to go through, and then we'll take a look. I'll give you some close-ups of what it looks like when I open it. So that is the initial steps: pine needles, sugar, and very pure water. And remember, don't put this in direct sunlight. That's what causes failure so many times, is direct sunlight. It overheats and your yeast does not produce the carbon dioxide effect. Now, for whatever reason, if you opened it after the 6th or 7th day and you didn't have the carbonation level you had hoped for, you can reseal it and allow 1 to 2 more days of carbonation, so the process may still be taking place. There may be something along the way that you did wrong, such as it was too cold, you put it in direct sunlight, the water wasn't filtered. So just remember, there's a lot of little mistakes you can make that will cause it not to work. But I actually degassed these just a little bit to see what would happen, but I'm going to put the mic right next to it when I open it so you can hear, and then we'll do a taste test. So I've set my mic right next to the bottle. We're going to open and see if we can capture the sound of the fizz. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of fizz created there, a lot of bubbles, so it looks like it's definitely worked. We're going to do the same thing, the same test with our mason jar. All right, so we've set our mic directly on top of the can or the mason jar. Let's see if we can hear it. Now, I heard it. I'm not sure if the mic picked it up, but there definitely was the sound of air escaping. And so, sorry, I know the mic's not directly next to me. You can't probably hear me that well, but I do see carbonation, lots of bubbles, and we're going to do a quick taste test. All right, so that was our sound test. Let's just do a little visual test. I'm going to shake it so you can see the carbonated bubbles in there. Try not to spill our mason jar, just kind of swirl it around and let you see. And there's a lot of carbonation at the bottom there, a lot of carbonation on all of the pine needles. So we're going to transfer this to a drinking glass and we're going to take a test. Okay, so you can use a cheesecloth or a small handheld strainer like this, a steel strainer. We're just going to pour our drink in and we're going to check for carbonation. Still ended up getting a pine needle in there, but you can see there's a lot of carbonation in there. It's not like a highly carbonated soda, but there is carbonated water there. All right, so if you look a little bit closer, you can see there is a little bit of carbonation there. It's not like a beer or anything like that where you're going to have massive amounts of carbonation, but it is lightly carbonated. All right, so let's do a quick taste test. It is lightly carbonated, so it definitely kind of reminds me of a Sprite. The sweetness is not as much of a Sprite. I find sometimes Sprite can be too sweet for me, but this definitely is reminiscent of Sprite, and there's a little bit of lemon flavor as well. A lot of people will add lemon zest to it or whatever their favorite spice is. Some people might add ginger to it to give it more of a spicy flavor. So it definitely tastes similar to a Sprite, but not exactly. It's definitely an unusual drink, and I think it's very refreshing in the summer, especially if you refrigerate it and drink it ice cold. So one last tip is to make sure you don't use a stainless steel or aluminum container to make this. Don't drink it out of there because pine is acidic and it can react with that and can kind of make the flavor a little bit off, so you may be disappointed. So I would recommend using real glass and real glass to drink out of, to make it and to drink out of is what I'm trying to say. So like I said, aluminum or stainless steel can kind of have a strange effect if you have some type of airtight container, so stay away from those. So guys, if you have a question about this video or any previous video, I believe there's over 200 in the catalog now, please become a public subscriber first, because I get so many comments and questions each day, it's hard for me to answer each one of them accurately. So if you are a public subscriber, I'll put you to the front of the line. Guys, I really appreciate you watching and have a great day.